In early 2023, Nintendo shadow dropped the long-rumored Metroid Prime Remastered, which sent shockwaves through Metroid fandom. The highly polished remaster delivered a truly impressive visual overhaul despite the ancient Switch hardware, as well as plenty of other enhancements like dual analog controls. Put simply, it's my favorite game of all time and my favorite version of Metroid Prime. However, the truth behind that preference is a bit more complicated. You see, in 2009, Nintendo also re-released Metroid Prime on the Wii via the Metroid Prime trilogy with support for widescreen, surprisingly fluid motion controls, and some other tweaks. That leaves us with three distinct versions of the original Metroid Prime, each with a surprisingly different feel if you really dig into it. Due to these re-releases, it's been a while since the GameCube version of Metroid Prime received any real attention from most gamers, and that's a shame. You see, I think in many ways, the original Metroid Prime for GameCube is arguably still the most interesting and unique version of this game, even if it has certainly been eclipsed by later iterations in terms of visuals and gameplay accessibility. Metroid Prime for GameCube delivers a very specific, unique, and visceral experience that's impossible to exactly recreate on other platforms, and in this video we're going to explore why that is. Please remember to hit subscribe to support the channel for more retro and current gaming analysis. I'm really trying to hit that 1,000 subscriber milestone and deliver more content, so I'd appreciate your help. Now, the unique qualities of Metroid Prime become apparent the moment you take control of Samus on the pirate frigate in the game's explosive introduction. There are so many minor, interesting elements of this version that add up to create something special, but two more significant elements hit you right away. The first thing you'll notice is the 4:3 aspect ratio. Now you might be thinking, well, obviously all older games are in 4:3, and that's true, but it has a particularly big impact on Metroid specifically. You see, Metroid Prime takes place almost entirely in narrow corridors and small interconnected environments. Reverting to a 4:3 view instead of 16:9 widescreen really narrows your perspective of the environment, and it amplifies the already claustrophobic feeling of this game. I'm not saying I prefer this view, but it is interesting what a major impact it has on the overall feel and gameplay experience in comparison to the more recent versions. The second major characteristic of the GameCube version is the single analog stick control scheme. No, there isn't an option to switch to dual analog. This has such a huge impact on the gameplay experience. Turning feels slower and heavier and creates a totally different feel for Samus's suit and arm cannon. It's more difficult to sort of peer around or lean into corners. Turning is a more sluggish, methodical experience, and it creates this feeling of a heavier suit with a helmet that has limited movement. In fact, if I had to describe the difference in feeling of the original game in one word, it would be weight. Movement just feels heavier and more intentional, for better or worse. This is probably the single biggest element that gamers who never played the original will struggle to adapt, but if you give it a chance, you might find yourself intrigued and immersed by it. I certainly prefer the remastered dual analog controls myself, but returning to the single analog controls provides a very interesting alternative. You're not even able to look up and down without coming to a full stop using the R shoulder button to switch to sort of a surveying mode. This creates a gameplay loop where you enter a room and sort of scan your surroundings before proceeding, which in some ways contributes to the feeling of exploration, bounty hunter tracking, and discovering detailed secrets. I do realize you can of course enable this control scheme on the Switch version, but for some reason it just doesn't feel the same. I think it's partially because in widescreen it's just more awkward, whereas here it feels so intentional and part of the claustrophobic mechanics. Your view is already limited in 4:3 aspect ratio, yet the game still makes you put in a bit of work to see more of your surroundings. The chunky GameCube buttons also make this feel different. Now, there's tons of other equally interesting minor, maybe even trivial qualities about the original GameCube version that still add up to much more than the sum of their parts. Walking animations are heavier, with more movement on the arm cannon as you trek around, and a more exaggerated camera tilt when you jump, further contributing to that heavier feel. Some of these options can be restored to some extent on the Switch version, but it still doesn't quite feel the same. The GameCube controller itself also creates a heavier feel, with super blocky, clickable shoulder buttons and joysticks that you really have to mash to get anything done. When you go back and play the original, you can tell this game was in many ways designed for the GameCube controller specifically. Some might hate going back to it, but it's interesting regardless. For example, Samus's visor HUD clearly lines up almost one-to-one with the layout of the GameCube controller. The lower right features your beam selection and animates as you switch between them using the C-stick. This makes the C-stick feel almost like a lever inside of the arm cannon, with the grooved border around the joystick on the controller that directs you to a specific angle. It gives beam swapping a more exaggerated, or again heavier, feeling than on the Wii or the Switch, which use a wheel selector or the D-pad respectively. On the lower left, you have your 4 visors mapped to the D-pad. The upper left shows your enemy radar, which makes sense since you use the left shoulder button to lock onto enemies. The clicking feeling on the GameCube controller shoulder button almost makes it feel like a literal lock-on. On the upper right you have your map, which makes sense since you use the right shoulder button to look around your environment. And in the middle you of course have your missile count, which makes sense since you use the Y button to fire, and that actually feels like a small trigger above the large A button on the GameCube controller that's used for primary fire. These controls feel unique during combat. Although the game automatically locks onto nearby enemies with the left shoulder button, you still have to stop and aim in that general direction using the right shoulder button. Once you've locked on, you can strafe and move around much quicker, and this gives the combat sort of a methodic pattern, as Samus's suit is much more powerful once it establishes that lock-on. The setup kind of reminds me of Resident Evil 4 originally, where you couldn't move around while manually aiming in order to increase suspense and tension. Turning around also takes more time, so you always want to keep the enemies in front of you, so this even influences combat strategy. As a side note, there's also no burst fire in the GameCube version like there is on Switch, so you have to fire every shot yourself, again, heavier. Jumping also feels very different in the GameCube version. You can't horizontally turn nearly as much while in the air, forcing you to line up and calculate your moves more, and of course you can see less of the environment due to the aspect ratio. The platforming feels very intentional and sort of a weird hybrid of smooth and clunky, much like real jumping might feel, as opposed to the fluid, smooth feeling of the dual analog remaster. You can hold down the left shoulder button to strafe, which is occasionally useful, but doesn't really speed up most things in a meaningful way. There's also no morph ball jump ability in this game at all, which means you have to do a manual bomb jump for any vertical movement. Again, a more mechanical or manual feel. A quick sidebar that if you're enjoying this content, there's never been a better time to subscribe. There's also still plenty of other differences that contribute to a more oppressive weight, both thematically and mechanically. It's amazing how well this game still holds up visually almost 25 years later. Again, due to its design, the full power of the GameCube is applied to one small area at a time, allowing for dense polygonal detail and impressive baked lighting, and this benefited the dated Switch as well. However, the original environments around you are noticeably less colorful and saturated than in the remaster. Everything looks a bit more desolate and drearier, with occasional spots of beauty. Part of this is due to the limited hardware, but I think to some extent a less vibrant color palette was also part of the original vision for the game. I personally prefer the more colorful, beautiful approach of the remaster, which I think effectively balances beauty and desolation, but the original is interesting and moody in its own way. There's a few aspects of the original visuals I actually prefer, which were also the source of some limited controversy during the remaster's release. Notably, I think the thermal visor actually looks much better in this game. It's a super neat looking effect in such an old game, whereas on the Switch it tends to look a bit blurry and washed out. The doors in the original also look much better, with a more subtle, glowing rim that looks more ancient and mechanical than the newer glowing versions. As a side note, the doors in the original often take several seconds to open to disguise slow loading. Although this can be annoying, it also weirdly contributes to this sense of a slower, clunkier feeling and adds to tension when you're fleeing enemies. So I think the original Metroid Prime on GameCube still delivers a truly unique relationship between game atmosphere, design, and control mechanics that all seamlessly meld with the console hardware, It's an immersive experience quite unlike anything else you might play from this decade or even last decade. There's such a feeling of weight and intentionality to everything you do in the game, and it all takes place in an isolated, oppressive, yet sometimes beautiful world. I also want to quickly mention that pretty much all of these factors are equally true in Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, if not more so. Although there's devastatingly no modern Echoes remaster at this point, we did get the same widescreen plus motion controls combo on the Wii that became the go-to experience for many. On GameCube, the Dark World feels even more oppressive in 4x3 than Prime 1, and there's darker terrors around every slow-turning corner. Environments are larger and more vertical, forcing you to manually survey your environment even more. Jumps are more complicated and frequent and require more thinking or precision. In the most popular video on my channel, I discuss why Echoes could potentially benefit from a remaster even more than Prime 1, and I think the ideas in this video feed into that as well. I believe it would be an even wider experience gap to go from GameCube to a Switch version of Echoes. It's interesting to think about. But what do you think? Have you played the GameCube original in recent years? Do you think it still holds up as an interesting, unique, and atmospheric experience? Do you think the original controls and gameplay design feel unique, or just dated and you never want to return to them? Leave a comment and let's discuss.